The Broad Street Bullcast is brought to you by Datmoji. Datmoji is the world's biggest website since MySpace. Read today's news by visiting datmoji.com. Updated daily and archived weekly. Follow Datmoji on Instagram and Twitter at Datmoji Live. Hello, everybody. This is Sam Carchidi from Philly Hockey Now, and we supply all the information you need on the Philadelphia Flyers hockey team. And we want to thank you for joining us for episode 3 of the Broad Street Bullcast. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast on YouTube and follow us on Spotify. We have a lot to talk about today. We had today's Wednesday. We had a press conference in Voorhees. The subject of the press conference was the upcoming NHL draft, which of course will be held next week, next Thursday and Friday in Montreal. The Flyers have the number 5 overall pick, so there's a lot of suspense and a lot of excitement because the Flyers are going to get a player who's going to help them out. Probably not right away, but maybe in a year or so. And I think the first thing probably the most important thing that came out of this press conference today was Chuck Fletcher, the general manager, and Brent Flair, the assistant general manager, and the guy that runs the draft. They talked at length about the draft and about fielding phone calls for prospective trade clients, if you will. And Chuck Fletcher made it clear that the Flyers are willing to trade down in this draft if they can get some assets. And whether that asset is a player, a young player, he specified, or whether that asset is another draft pick. In other words, if the Flyers trade down, let's say to number 11 or 12 or so, they give up the number 5 pick overall, they get 11 or 12, and they also get another pick. And Fletcher made it clear today they want to get a second-round pick if possible because, as you know, they do not have a second-round pick in this draft. They lost that in the Shane Gostisbehere trade. They gave up a 7 and a number 2 just for Arizona to take Shane Gostisbehere and his $4.5 million contract. And Gostisbehere had a very solid year, 14 goals, 51 points. He would have been the Flyers' top scorer. So that's a subject for another day. We won't get into that. But the bottom line is the Flyers would like to recoup that second-round draft pick. And but we're going to get into some of the conversation. But before we do, I want to talk about the 6 players that are probably on board for the Flyers. The first 3 players probably will not be available. We all kind of know who the first 3 players are going to be. So let's just jump right down to what I called last week the Super 6. These are the 6 guys that could end up with the Flyers, possibly at number 5 or possibly if they trade down to one of those spots. Just to refresh your memory, Cutter Gauthier, he's a center left winger, a guy I think the Flyers will ultimately take at number 5 if they don't trade down. He's on that list. 2 defensemen on the list, Simon Nemec, also David Juracek. They're both right-handed. From what I'm told, both will probably need another year before they're NHL ready. Both are outstanding prospects. A couple right wingers on that list, Joachim Kemmel and Jonathan Lekermaki. And then Matt Savoy is also on the list. Matt Savoy is a center right winger. I'm told the Flyers probably will not take him at number 5. But again, if they trade down and he's available later on, do not be surprised if they took him there. He's a guy that I actually would like to see the Flyers take. If you can get Matt Savoy, later in the draft, say 11, 12 or whatever, and get a second-round pick, that would be, to me, the best-case scenario for the Flyers. But as I mentioned earlier, it seemed to me that Fletcher will do his best to try to trade this pick down, and that won't be easy. And either trading up or down does not happen too often, especially with a number 5 overall pick. Also, Chuck and Brent Flair kind of implied that there's not much difference between the players at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So basically 4 to 10, you're going to get a player that's going to help you. Maybe not a superstar as you would with Shane Wright or Slavkovsky or Cooley, the guys that are expected to go 1, 2, 3, but guys maybe just a shade beneath them, but very, very good players that have a chance to be an all-star in the NHL. And if they believe they have a chance to get the second round pick and to get one of these players that I just mentioned in 4 to 10, I wouldn't be surprised if they pull the trigger. So for those that don't know, the first round in Montreal will be next Thursday. That's July 7th. The second round, that's 2 to 7, will be on Friday. Also, Flair and Fletcher did not want to give away any impressions and what they thought about specific players. I specifically asked them about Cutter Gauthier, and they said they really don't want to comment on him because if they comment on him, then they're going to have to comment on other players. And I understand that. I mean, they don't want to give anything away, but I did try, because I think Gauthier is the guy they're going to pick. So I specifically asked about him and was hoping they gave us some insight. And sometimes you can read between the lines on what they think about a player. But they did not want to talk about Gauthier at all. And the other thing, I asked Brent Flair again. Our job is to try to get information. And I said, if all things were equal, what would you do if a defenseman was on board and a forward was on board? You could take either one. Which position would you pick? Now, I'm not specifically talking about any players. And he said to me that you're trying to get dirt from me and you're trying to get more information than I can give. So, that quickly didn't go anywhere. And because if Brent Flair did lean one way or the other, I think it would tell you whether the Flyers are leaning towards a Gauthier or a David Juracek, right-handed defenseman. I kind of think that Simon Nemec will be gone at number 4 to Seattle. So to me, it may come down to David Juracek or Cutter Gauthier, just from talking to people around the NHL. So Fletcher also said he talked for an hour. I thought this was very interesting. He talked for an hour with his staff yesterday, just trying to feel out how far they would drop down. In other words, how comfortable do you feel that we're going to get one of these players that they have rated, say, 4 to 10? How comfortable do you feel if we move back? How far can we move back? In other words, don't move past 11. Don't move past 14 or whatever. So they have this all laid out. And again, a lot of talk about a trade. But I thought it was interesting that they talked for an hour specifically. They went around the table and they talked to scouts and different people in the organization about how far down they would go to make this selection. Also, I want to make it clear, the Flyers, and I wrote this today for Philly Hockey Now, the Flyers must get this pick right. A lot depends on it. You don't get the number 5 pick too often, and you don't really want to have a top 5 pick too often, of course, because that means you're way down in the standings. Only the Flyers started in '68, but their first draft was before their first season. So actually, the first draft the Flyers were involved in was the 1967 draft, and they did have a high pick in that one. They were an expansion team then, of course, but only 7 times in the Flyers' history have the Flyers had a pick in the top 5. And I outlined that in the story today on Philly Hockey Now, and you can go down and see the list. And they've done okay. Not great. They've done okay when they've had a top 5 pick. This time, it's even more critical that they do well. Why? For one, they're coming off their second worst season in history. For another, they have missed the playoffs 2 straight years. For another, they've won 1 playoff series, 1 in the last 10 years. And last but not least, I think Chuck Fletcher is on the hot seat here. He needs to get a pick that is going to make an impact in the NHL relatively quickly. Will that player make an impact in the first year? It's almost definite he won't. It's almost definite that player probably won't be in the NHL in the first year unless they trade up and get one of the guys that's going to be 1, 2, or 3. And even then, it's unlikely. I think Slavkovsky, the big left winger, is probably the only player in this draft that is NHL ready. So, but is it possible, even probable, that the player the Flyers pick will be an NHL regular in his second year? Yes. So that's why this is important to Chuck Fletcher. He needs to hit on this draft pick. And if he doesn't, the Flyers, are going to be in sad shape because, the pipeline for the Flyers right now is not flowing with talent. They do have some good youngsters that are probably going to be part of this team, but they need to build up the farm system, and that is why Chuck Fletcher is trying to get more draft picks. It's why he's trying to get back a number 2 pick. That would be a key. And even better, if he can get a draft pick for 2023, say in the second round, that might even be better than getting a second round pick in the 2022 draft, because the 2023 draft is loaded, and the Flyers would love to have an abundance of picks in 2023. We're going to come back with the mailbag and a lot more, so stay tuned. We'll be back right after this quick message. The Broad Street Bullcast is brought to you by thatmoji.com. Pictures that bring you the news, plus 24/7 commercial-free music and live streams. Follow Datmoji on Instagram and Twitter at DatmojiLive. We're back at the Broad Street Bullcast. Thanks for joining us, and this is one of my favorite parts. We go into the mailbag. We took questions from the readers on Twitter and got some great ones. I want to thank everybody for submitting the questions. We get tons of them. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer them all, but I really do appreciate it. And this is all for you and for me and back and forth, and can't thank you enough. And before I get into questions, had a question today from Wayne Fish, the great Flyers writer who's been with covering the Flyers for, I think, almost a half a century. He's now with FlyingFish.com, and he asked me what I was watching on TV. The writers haven't gotten together too much since the season ended because Flyers, of course, weren't in the playoffs. But I'm watching The Offer right now. I give it 4 or 5 stars. For those who don't know, it's how The Godfather was made and the behind-the-scenes stuff. It's fascinating, and I really recommend it. Wayne recommends The Old Man with Jeff Bridges. So want to get that out there. So for all you TV watchers out there, make sure you watch The Offer. It's phenomenal. My cousin said he actually likes The Offer better than The Godfather. That's a little out of the way, but let's get right to the questions, though. First one on Twitter from Ryan Arrow. Ryan asked, would you consider the players that should be available around the number 5 pick plug-and-play players? In other words, would you plug them in, they'll play right away? Or would they most likely need a year, 2 years, or more to develop further? Good question, Ryan, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. Cutter Gauthier, 6'2", 200-pound center left winger. He's going to Boston College. I think he'll be ready in a year from the scouts I talked to. That's how they project him. You'll remember years ago when the Flyers took James Van Riemsdyk, the Flyers projected that he would be ready in a year if they took him. He was the number 2 pick overall that year, and it turned out he wanted 2 years in college. The Flyers were not happy with that. They wanted him to come after 1 year, but they had to live with it, and JVR came out, and it turned out to be a good decision by JVR because he is close to 300 goals. So, but I think just from talking to the scouts, I think that Gauthier, if he is the player the Flyers pick, would be ready in year 2 if he progresses and stays away from injuries. The other guys are considering Simon Nemec and David Jurček. Same thing with those guys. From what the scouts tell me, they think they both will be ready in year 2. Maybe they would need a little more seasoning with the Phantoms, maybe 3 months or so, but they're going to be in the NHL very early. The other guys, I would say that they're further along, mostly because of their size. And the other guys, Joachim Kemmel, Jonathan Lekermaki, Matt Savoy, Frank Nazar. They're all in the 5'9", 5'10", 170, 165. Some of them are, 175. They have to develop physically. So I don't think you're going to see those guys probably for at least 3 years. So maybe 21, maybe 22 before they reach the NHL. And which is another reason you would think that the Flyers are probably going to pick Gauthier or Juracek or Nemec, because those guys are closer to the NHL, and you know how much help the Flyers need as soon as possible. Mike Evangelista on Twitter says, is Cutter Gauthier a poor man's Slafkovsky, and how far apart are they in talent and as far as NHL upside? Real good question, Mike. And, I think there is a significant difference. I think Gauthier is going to be a real good player in the league. But, just from talking to scouts, Slafkovsky's got a chance to be more than that. I think this guy is going to be a perennial all-star. And, he's got more size than Gauthier. He's probably got a better shot than Gauthier. I'm not so sure his defense is as good as Gauthier. So Gauthier is a very well-rounded player if the Flyers go that route. But, it's interesting because all along, Shane Wright, the consensus, he is number one. The center, he looks like he's a two-way player, great two-way player, and he looks like he's going to be a very good player in the NHL. But all along, everybody has had him number one. But Bob McKenzie, the Bob father, he came out the other day and changed his rankings. He put up his final rankings. He actually had Slafkovsky at number 5 in his previous ranking. Number 5 is the Flyers, of course. And he switched it around, and now he has Slafkovsky as number 1. And he's just basing it on what he thinks is the talent level. So he thinks Slafkovsky, and again, he did this talking to 10 different scouts. So the scouts that he talked to anyway think Slafkovsky is number 1 and Shane Wright number 2. That doesn't mean he thinks that the draft is going to go that way. I don't think it will. I think Montreal will pick Shane Wright. They need a center. But it's very interesting. That's how much Slafkovsky's star has risen. Steve Riccio asked, when do you see Torts selecting his coaching staff, and do you think his approach will be different than the other coaches? Good question, Steve. Today, Chuck Fletcher announced that the Flyers are going to retain Darrell Williams. He was an assistant for most of last year, and they also are going to retain Kim Dillabo. Of course, he's a longtime goalie coach, and Williams will be kind of the eye in the sky. He'll be a guy who sits in the press box and takes notes during the games, and then after the game is over, he'll go into the locker room and tell the coaching staff and the players, what he saw from up there. Sometimes the game looks a lot different from upstairs. It certainly looks a lot easier than it does at ice level. So, he'll go down and talk to Torts about what he saw. And so he will have that role. Dilbo, as I mentioned, will still be the goalie coach. It seems like Tortorella and Fletcher will probably need at least 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, before they name their other 2 assistants. And Fletcher today said these will be 2 very key hires. One of the guys, of course, will run the offense and the power play. The other will run the defense and the penalty kill. And how much the Flyers special team suffered last year. So, we'll see how that plays out. But I got the sense that they're in no rush. Now that the season's over, they can talk to a lot more people that may be interested, but I expect that probably in the next 2 weeks. Jerry D asks, when do you suspect we'll get a definite update on Ryan Ellis? Well, I should say a definitive update on Ryan Ellis, and we got one update. It wasn't the definitive update, but we did get an update today, and it sounded positive in the beginning, but there was a little bit of gloom in there towards the end. Chuck Fletcher said that Ryan Ellis, of course, who's a top pairing defenseman, only played in 4 games last year because of the pelvic injury. And he said that, he's progressing nicely. he's making progress, but not skating yet. And but then when we pressed him, he said he has no idea whether he'll be ready for camp, and that his rehab really is in the early stages. That to me, it sounded a little bit ominous, and I don't want to be negative here and shed the wrong light. But if I'm reading between the lines, I do not think they're going to rush Ryan Ellis. I would not be surprised if they took him along slowly, and I get the feeling that if he starts the season on time, great. That would be a bonus. But if he doesn't, but if he's ready, say in week 2, week 3, they're happy with that. They don't want to rush him back. I know it's been a long time, but he's got a lot of different issues, and I asked Chuck Fletcher today. I said, does that kind of hamstring you because you don't know yet? You don't know if you need to get another right-handed defenseman. How do you approach trades? How do you approach free agency? Not knowing if your number one right-handed defenseman is not available. And he said that, well, we should know sometime next month, where we stand. So, there are some quality free agents out there. Chris Letang, quality right-handed free agents. Chris Letang is one, probably too expensive. John Klingberg is out there. Justin Schultz is out there. So keep an eye on that, because we'll get more information probably in another 3 or 4 weeks. Probably get an update again, whether it's the definitive update or not, I don't know. But my impression is they're going to take it slow with Ryan Ellis. And I thought it was also really interesting that Chuck Fletcher opened up a bit about Ryan Ellis when he came here last year and how excited he was after he got over the shock of being traded by Nashville, where he spent his whole career. And after he got over that shock, he was probably the most excited person in camp, Fletcher said, and he wanted to do everything on the ice, off the ice with Ivan Provorov, who of course is his pair, his defensive pair, and his partner out there. And he said he would eat breakfast with Provy, he would eat lunch with Provy. He wanted to find out about Provy's family, about his family in Russia, and what he liked to do. He said he just really wanted to develop that chemistry on and off the ice. I thought that was really interesting. It gave another side of Ryan Ellis, and you really got a feel for the guy. I mean, this is a guy who is an excellent defenseman, a top pairing defenseman. Only played 4 games, but Provorov was at his best when Ellis was with him, and he will mean so much to the Flyers if they can get him back at 100%. This defense really falls into place so much better than it did last year. So, keep your fingers crossed about that, about Ryan Ellis. Hopefully, we'll get some good news next month. Chris asked, are the Flyers really going the next season with a backup goalie who has 0 NHL wins on his resume? Chris, I think that's not a great possibility, but a good possibility. Let's put it that way. Felix Sandstrom, Ivan Fedotov, they're the guys that right now are battling for the backup spot behind Carter Hart. And I asked Chuck Fletcher today if he had a veteran goalie in mind, if he thought he needed to add a veteran goalie, whether in a trade or in free agency. And he said he still wasn't sure about that. And he weighed out the cap savings that you get if Sandstrom and Fedotov are if either of them are the backup. But remember, Fedotov and Sandstrom are not youngsters; they're 25 years old. So I got the feeling that Fletcher is not against using one of them as the backup, and not only because it saves some money cap-wise, but he thinks these guys are poised and ready to handle the load and maybe, just maybe, push Carter Hart a little bit. And so we'll see how that plays out. But some of the free agents, Martin Jones, of course, who was here last year with the Flyers, they have not ruled out possibly re-signing him. Braden Holtby is a free agent. David Riddick. Riddick is probably not a guy on their list. Casey DeSmith, he's 30 years old, had a solid year. Wouldn't break the bank. If you wanted to go with a veteran, he would be a good guy. But, that's where they stand now. But I would not be shocked if Sandstrom or Ivan Fedotov is a backup next year. So, again, we'll see how it plays out. Camp is a few months away. Chuck Fletcher right now is concerned about the draft next week. After that, we have free agency. And before you know it, we'll be starting camp, and the season will start in October. They still haven't announced officially when it will start. But for the Flyers anyway, the league will start, I believe, October 11th. But the Flyers do not have their schedule yet, but they will start around October 11th. But I want to thank everybody for the questions. I want to thank everybody for watching episode 3 of the Broad Street Bullcast. And again, this is Sam Carchidi from Philly Hockey Now, and I love to quote the late, great Gene Hart. Good night and good hockey.